The shadows are growing longer, the air is getting colder, and out there in the darkness, something stirs. Stories whispered in hushed tones, tales that send shivers down your spine. These are the stories that keep us up at night. These are 3 true scary stories sent in by viewers, just like you. People who experienced the unexplainable, who felt the icy breath of fear on their skin. Tonight, we delve into their nightmares, into the darkest corners of their minds. If you enjoy this type of content and would like to see more of it and support the channel, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications. Our first story comes from Sarah, who experienced something terrifying while camping with friends. They were deep in the woods, miles from civilization, the only light coming from their crackling campfire. Laughter and stories filled the air, pushing back the encroaching darkness. But as the night deepened, a strange feeling settled over Sarah. It started subtly, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She brushed it off at first, attributing it to nerves, to the shadows playing tricks on her in the firelight. But the feeling persisted, growing stronger with every passing moment. Later that night, while her friends slept soundly in their tents, Sarah lay awake, her heart pounding in her chest. The woods were alive with sounds, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs, the distant hoot of an owl. Each sound sent a jolt of fear through her, her imagination conjuring up unseen horrors in the darkness. Then, she saw it, a flicker of movement in the trees at the edge of the campsite. At first she thought it was an animal, a deer drawn to the warmth of the fire, but then it moved again, this time more deliberately, and Sarah realized with a growing sense of dread that it was human-shaped. She sat up, her eyes wide with fear, her breath catching in her throat. The figure was still there, partially hidden by the trees, but she could see it clearly now, a tall, shadowy form, its features obscured by the darkness. It stood completely still, watching them, its silence somehow more unnerving than any sound it could have made. Fear rooted Sarah to the spot, her mind racing. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure turned and melted back into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. Sarah lay there for what felt like hours, her heart pounding, her eyes darting around the campsite, searching for any sign of movement. She didn't see the figure again that night, but the experience left her deeply shaken. Our next story takes us into the chilling world of childhood fears, a place where shadows seem to hold secrets and whispers echo with unseen terrors. This story comes from Mark, who grew up in an old house, a house with a history, a house that seemed to hold its breath and watch him. From a young age, Mark felt uneasy in the house, a constant sense of unease that clung to him like cobwebs. He would hear strange noises at night, footsteps creaking in the hallway, the sound of objects moving in the attic above his room. But the most unsettling thing was the whispering. It started subtly, a faint murmur that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. At first, Mark dismissed it as his imagination, the product of an overactive child's mind, but the whispering persisted, growing louder, clearer. It always seemed to be closest at night, when the house was dark and silent. Mark would lie in bed, his heart pounding in his chest, listening to the whispers swirling around him, slithering out from the darkness like tendrils of smoke. He could never quite make out what the voice was saying, but it sounded mournful, filled with a deep, abiding sadness. Sometimes he thought he could hear his name being whispered, called out from the shadows, and a cold shiver would run down his spine. He tried talking to his parents about it, but they dismissed it as nightmares, childish fears. They told him the house was old, that old houses made noises, that it was all in his head. But Mark knew better. He knew there was something else in that house with him, something unseen, something that whispered in the darkness. One night, the whispering reached a fever pitch. It felt like the walls themselves were alive, vibrating with the sound of the voice. Terrified, Mark pulled his blankets over his head, trying to shut out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers were all around him, closing in, suffocating him. He couldn't take it anymore. He jumped out of bed and ran to his door, throwing it open and racing down the hallway to his parents' room. He burst through their door, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His parents were startled awake, demanding to know what was wrong. Through his tears, Mark tried to explain about the whispering, the voice, the fear that had been haunting him for so long. But his parents just looked at him with a mixture of annoyance and concern. They told him to calm down, that it was just a bad dream. Chapter 3. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. Our final story tonight is a chilling reminder that sometimes the open road can lead to places far more terrifying than any destination. This story comes from David, a long-haul trucker who's seen his fair share of strange and unsettling things on his travels. David was driving his usual route, a long stretch of desolate highway that cut through the heart of the country. It was late, the moon a sliver in the vast, star-studded sky, the only sound the hum of his engine and the occasional howl of a coyote in the distance. As he rounded a bend in the road, his headlights illuminated a lone figure standing by the side of the highway. It was a young woman, her thumb extended in the universal sign of a hitchhiker. She wore a simple white dress, her long dark hair blowing in the wind, her face pale in the moonlight. David was a kind soul, used to the loneliness of the open road, and something about the woman's vulnerable appearance tugged at his heartstrings. He slowed his truck, pulling over to offer her a ride. The woman smiled gratefully, her eyes shining with relief, and climbed into the passenger seat. She introduced herself as Emily, her voice soft and melodic, and explained that she was heading to the next town over, her car having broken down miles back. David felt a pang of sympathy for her, and they chatted easily as he drove, the miles melting away in the darkness. Emily told him about her life, her dreams, her hopes for the future. She was a captivating storyteller, and David found himself drawn in by her tale, her gentle demeanor calming the usual loneliness of his long drives. As they neared the turnoff for the town Emily had mentioned, David glanced over at her, expecting her to point out her destination. But when he looked, his blood ran cold. The passenger seat was empty. He slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind struggling to comprehend what he had just witnessed. He looked frantically around the cab of his truck, but there was no sign of Emily. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Shaking, David pulled his truck to the side of the road and jumped out, searching desperately for any sign of the hitchhiker. He checked the back of the truck, the surrounding woods, but there was nothing. It was as if she had never existed. David stood there for a long moment, the silence of the night pressing in on him, the weight of what he had just experienced settling heavily on his shoulders. He had heard stories, whispers on the CB radio of phantom hitchhikers, of restless spirits seeking passage, but he had always dismissed them as tall tales. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of darkness. The stories we've shared tonight are a reminder that the line between our world and the unknown is thin, easily breached by the shadows that lurk at the edge of our perception. If you have a true scary story to share, please email me at marnightmareinbox@gmail.com. Your story could be featured in the next video. And until next time, sleep tight, if you can.